Hey guys, this is Chris with Drop Dice. So I'm going to introduce a new little mini-series, if you will, called Choice Matters. And here we're going to talk about some of the choices that you can make as a DM and player and some variable options and things like that and how they can really define and change your game, adding a lot of tone and depth to it. So let's kind of talk about what started my inspiration for the Choice Matters series, because I think understanding where I start from kind of will help give you some guidance in understanding where I'm going to go with it. So earlier today, Don Forgecast put out a broadcast. I believe he calls the series Ask a GM. I'm going to link it at the bottom. I may get the name wrong, but he basically does this kind of every so often where he talks about some different topics. He's been emailed by people, and one of the things that he was emailed was the fact that he has a viewer who has a table where the people playing the game are mainly atheist, and they just generally don't like playing clerics. And the question became kind of more of a discussion of the people who are atheist not wanting to play religious characters, and maybe that's a comfort zone thing. I think that kind of spiraled into more what actually got me thinking about this topic and why these choices matter so much. Somebody inside the comments section on Facebook went in to talk about how if you have a world with gods, how do you become atheist in a game like that, because the gods are there. You could simply say, I don't believe in the gods, and one of them could show up and beat you up. And then there were other comments about how gods could simply be higher level beings that people don't understand, and other questions about what faith actually means. And I think that these choices are super concrete and super important for your game, so that's what I want to discuss. And today I'm going to discuss the choice of religion and why religion really matters inside your games. And this is designed around the element of D&D and focus, basically any sort of medieval fantasy where gods are running around. However, say that you have a sci-fi game going on and the world that the players are going to is highly religious. This might be something to think about inside that world, and you can twist it to match some of the rules of the universe, if you will. But let's first talk about the root level of what kind of gods that you have, because that matters probably the most out of everything. Do you have gods that are alive? Do you have gods that are dead? How does that affect their magic? If they are alive, where do clerics get their magic from? And these are all kind of unique, different questions, and I'm going to kind of talk to you about what I've made in the past as far as decisions goes, and how that affected my games. So when I first started playing D&D, I was a big avid fan of Dragonlance. In Dragonlance, the gods are dead at the beginning of the story, and then a cleric is specifically given her powers through the gods. And that's really important for that story because it shows that the gods are not dead, that they're alive, that simply mankind has turned their back on the gods. And I fell in love with this concept because the gods are basically parasites in Dragonlance. They get their power from the faithful. However, in turn, I shouldn't say the parasites, they're more like symbiotes. Um, and this is kind of a good way to classify your gods, how you want them to be structured. Do you want the cleric to be the parasite, the god to be the parasite, or do you want a symbiotic relationship? So bear with me. I'll make it all make sense here in just a minute. So in Dragonlance, it's a symbiotic relationship. So the gods give their powers to the clerics so that the clerics can share the faith with the people, and the people's faith in turn powers the gods, which then reciprocates back to the clerics, making them more powerful. So gods with more followers have clerics that are more powerful, and it creates this kind of snowball effect that eventually the god becomes so powerful that everyone has to recognize that the god exists. And the simple fact that they are recognized, not necessarily followed, is what allows them to continue to exist in the world. In Dragonlance, once the people started forgetting about the gods and assuming that the gods were dead because the gods punished people with a cataclysm, actually multiple cataclysms, when that happened, the gods began to dwindle in power, the clerics began to dwindle in power, and mankind didn't understand what this connection of a symbiotic relationship with their gods was. So instead, they came to the conclusion that the gods were dying, and because they became faithful in this construct that gods are dying and that they're no longer alive, it made clerics weak until the point that they didn't exist. Clerical magic stopped happening. That could be one way to go, is a symbiotic relationship. And let's talk about a different way, that the clerics are the parasite. This is kind of the more common one that you see in things like Forgotten Realms, where the gods are all over the place. You know that they're there, and the gods specifically give their power to clerics, but clerics don't necessarily do anything to affect the gods. Like whether the gods are being followed faithfully or not, the gods still exist. They simply give out their power for whatever grand scheming and planning that they have in mind. Another great example of this, actually probably the best example of this, is the Roman gods and the Greek gods. They continue to exist regardless of anybody who being faithful in them. They had their powers and they could distribute it as they saw fit. And that could be a good premise for your story, but it becomes, so now your god is giving you power. What are you doing in return for your god? These kinds of gods that are acting as the host to the parasitic cleric usually want something in return. And the cleric will always fall short because it's not a full symbiotic relationship. The god will never find something that the cleric can really give them that 100% satisfies the god, which is why I said the Roman gods are kind of the perfect example for this. Now let's flip it around. Say that the cleric is the host and the god is the parasite. The god needs the faith. What does the cleric get out of the god in this parasitic relationship? And it's hard to say inside that one, and I really like that one because it's a different kind of construct. So in my games nowadays, what I do is a little bit different than how I started. When I started, I did the symbiotic relationship, and then I tried kind of the clerics being the parasite of the god. So if the god died in that situation, the cleric would lose their power, period, done. However, in the opposite relationship, that the cleric is the host and the god is the parasite, if the god dies, the cleric remains powerful. And this is why. Because of the definition of faith. Now, I'm going to change screens real quick here. Let's talk about faith in a religious sense. Faith is a strong belief in God or in the doctrine of a religion based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof. So this poses kind of an interesting point here. Essentially, what I'm saying is if the cleric is the host and the god is the parasite, the cleric can exist without the god. So if the god dies, the cleric continues to maintain so long as they maintain the faith, until they are shown proof that the god is dead, which may shake their foundation and may cause them to lose their power. The alternative is something more interesting to me. They could instead become reinvigorated in the dogma and find that their god's death was more of a martyr situation. They could become back and become even better. And let's say that you instead want to explore this concept with the parasitic or with a symbiotic relationship. The god has diminished in followers. They've fallen into what the final stages before their death, the god sleep, taking inspiration from the Odin sleep from Asgardian myth. So the god goes into this deep slumber until the faithful are strong enough to support his life again. Your cleric is now charged with this duty to go out and find and create the faithful, because if he doesn't, his god will die. And this is probably one of the more interesting ideas, because now I'm thinking of a story where maybe the cleric gets something like a rose, like in Sleeping Beauty, or excuse me, Beauty and the Beast, and the rose shows time, and as petals fall, the god is going weaker. However, if the cleric's doing a good job, maybe a new bud forms, maybe it blooms and it becomes more vibrant, and the single rose that you started with branches off and becomes a dozen roses, and that's how you know that the god has arisen, or whatever the trinket is, of course. But this allows you to use the 5th edition trinkets in a very unique and special kind of way. So really, your choices define how you should answer these questions. So that's going to be it for this episode. I'm going to try and make them real short, 10-minute videos. That's my new goal for the New Year's. Keep all of them short and sweet. But I want to get you kind of thinking about it. Next time, we'll talk about choice mattering when it comes to classes. I think this one pretty much sums up the cleric. So next time, we'll pick something out and discuss why that choice matters in the grand scheme of things and how you can really dive deeper into what the concept is. As always, guys, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you at the gaming table.